all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park.
Oops. Why did it stop?
In the United States, when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to
All right, sorry. Every time I click the button, evidently to change the volume.
many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately, those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Get out of this without it starting over again. Nope. Yep. No. Oh no. All right. Perfect. Oh, finally. So I apologize off the bat. I do not have that beautiful narrator voice, so you're gonna have to listen to my annoying tone, evidently, compared to that. And if you didn't realize, this is a European narrator, and so when they say deer, they mean elk. But all that being said, it's a beautiful visualization of this idea. And it's the idea that we've incorporated into our academic teaching, our high school classrooms, or anybody in the general public, when there's a good chance somebody will know what a trophic cascade is at some level. And that idea comes from Yellowstone National Park and the reintroduction of wolves. And I think we all gravitate to that idea partially for the simplicity of it, but also because of it supports this idea that humankind can fix our mistakes, if you will. We extirpated, this is a chat, I'm making sure I'm not, something's not messing up. Oh, okay, perfect. It supports this idea that we can fix our mistakes, right? We extirpated wolves from the park by 1926. The system dramatically changed. We brought them back. And this supports the idea that we were rapidly able to restore our and forgive ourselves, if you will. And the public has gravitated to this. So let's see, come on, there we go. Oh, there we go. So the last time I gave this talk was about a year ago. Since this video was released on YouTube, it had been viewed almost 42 million times. I pulled this up yesterday, I was curious. Now we're almost to 43 million views of this video. That's 1 million views in 327 days. Over 3,000 people are watching this video 7 years after it was released. Now in science, if we could ever imagine any of us having that kind of impact, we could retire now and be happy and think we succeeded as scientists. Because we produced something that, one, was understandable, and two, the people were engaged in and interested in. And the idea of Yellowstone is not, Yellowstone isn't a single example of this, and this ability to potentially restore a system. So, probably the best and clearest examples of this are the sea otters examples in the kelp forest, but examples exist across the world. So we've got, bass fisheries in lakes. We've got jaguars on small islands, and then we've got Yellowstone and the Trophic Cascade. And of course, this is Bill Ripple's photo from that seminal paper talking about introducing the idea of this. Now, the idea that this is happening in a broad context probably isn't that relevant to the general public. All they want to know is, did it happen? Now, from an academic setting, we're a little bit more interested in the mechanisms of why it may have happened or how it might have happened. Because if we can understand the mechanisms, perhaps we can replicate it. We can use these tools other places. We can restore tigers to India. We can reintroduce wolves to Scotland. Whatever the conversation about a large predator and its ability to structure an ecosystem, it fundamentally relies on the idea that basically they can impact their prey. And so because I really like cartoons and I'm in outreach, and so I think they're the best way to display this kind of information, I'll introduce these two different pathways, and we'll talk about why it's important to understand these pathways. And I'll walk through my own science and then some other science that my collaborators and other folks have worked on to figure out whether or not and how this is happening. So in a trophic cascade, a density immediate effect, that's how we normally think of it. This is the kelp forest example. In this case, we're going to think about Simba out in the African Serengeti, and we've got our impala. So a numerical effect would be Simba runs into the field, he eats the impala, and the grass grows. That's a numerical or density mediated trophic cascade. What the video is proposing has happened in Yellowstone is what we'd interpret as a behaviorally mediated trophic cascade. So we have our same system here, a behavioral effect. In this case, when Simba chases after the impala, they actually move somewhere else. And in this case, the grass grows. We see the exact same trophic response, but it happens by a very different mechanism. I'll probably use the term behavioral or fear effect interchangeably. That's how the literature works. So you may hear me use both those terms. Just know I'm meaning the same thing here. Now, what's important to note about a behavioral effect is you can still end up with less, in this case, impala, because maybe they went to a crappier place and they ended up starving to death or having lower reproduction. And so there's two ways that they can either be scared and leave the area, or they can actually leave the area and die. And that also further creates a feedback loop in which we might see these plant responses. All right, so that's how we would think about this potentially applying in Yellowstone. The wolves ate all the elk, or they scared all the elk. So this idea originates, and this was the cartoon figure that was in National Geographic in the early 2000s that really captured the imagination of the American public with this idea of restoring wolves. So on the left here, we have, and I think you guys can see my mouse, but we have an elk system that's heavily grazed on the creek bottoms. We've got eroded banks. We've got some coyotes, but not any predators. And we've got very tall aspen with no regeneration. The idea being that when the wolves came back, they scared the elk up in the uplands. We start to see regeneration of the aspen, and we have other predators, bears and beavers and other things restoring and returning the ecosystem. Everything that video captured. Now, to understand how this might have happened, I need to first explain to you where most of this work actually happens. So in Yellowstone National Park, there's 9 to 11 populations that use the park. This is a visualization from the elk migration book for the GYE. You can see some of these elk just use a little bit of the park, other ones use quite a bit of the park. And we're going to focus up here on this northern range. This is the one population or herd of elk that uses the park year round. The rest of them are seasonal migrants. They're really only there in the summer. So we zoom in on this northern part of the park. And this is important for a couple of reasons as it relates to the Trophic Cascade discussion. So one of the primary reasons, or one of the primary good opportunities that allows us to kind of tackle this question is because this is the site, the primary field site for the Yellowstone wolf winter study, predation study. So this is based off of the Isle Royale studies. And in essence, there's a 30-day window in November, December, and in March where we intensively study wolves and their interactions with their prey sources. So we get lots of information about predator-prey interactions, predator-predator, wolf-wolf, wolf-coyote, whatever. Calculate things like predation rate, distribution of wolves, genetics. We've done work with that, or I haven't, but collaborators have. But as part of that, because we're interested particularly in that predator-prey interactions, there's also been quite a bit of data collected on the elk side of things, so as their primary food source in the park. So we know quite a bit now about elk demographics, migration, space use is what I'm going to focus on mostly today. And so all this information is compiled really primarily focused in this northern range area. And that becomes important also when we relate to things like aspen and willow, which I'll touch on in a second. All right, so we've got a lot of data that we've collected in this one specific area of the park. And that includes a pretty decent understanding, at least over the last, say, 80 years of what the elk population has looked like. So this is numbers put out by my advisor, Dan McNulty, in his lab. Actually, Joel Ruprecht, I think, helped with this original model, who's a PhD student there at OSU now. But you can see here, this is what we think the elk population was at park establishment in 1872. So the numbers have been brought really down, largely by market hunting. They increased quite rapidly when the cavalry came in to protect the elk population. These circles are pretty raw numbers. We're not really sure how accurate they are. But this is what we call the elk protection period. Starting in the 1920s, we have the Elk Removal Phase. This was basically culling of elk because they were overgrazing the rangeland system, the riparian system, the range, everything. We knew there was too many elk, and so they were systematically removing elk, shooting and leaving for predators, or they also served as a large source for many of the elk populations throughout the Western United States were reintroduced from these elk that were taken out of Yellowstone. So we brought down the elk population relatively rapidly. And just as a heads up, wolves were excreted somewhere in this point about 1926. Then we begin the phase of natural regulation. So the Wilderness Act is passed. We're going to let things be. And we see as soon as that happens, we stop removals of elk from the park. We see a rapid increase in the number of elk on the landscape. This makes sense in part because we removed the human harvest, but there's also very few predators left at this time. Grizzly bears do exist, but they're largely fed at garbage dumps and things like that. And so elk ramp up very, very quickly and peak in around the late 1980s, early 1990s. All right. As a side note, and interestingly enough, the management objective goal for the park for elk during this regulation period, which was set in like the 40s, was about 4,000 head of elk on the northern range. And this is just the northern range we're talking about. So that one population that resides there year round. Surprisingly, now we're actually really close to that number. So it's kind of interesting that the system may have hit a balance at somewhere where managers 6 years ago thought was a good balance. Wolves are reintroduced originally in 1995 and 1996. There was actually a planned reintroduction in 1997, but they did so well they didn't have to do it. And this period right here is where the idea of the Trophic Cascade is really born. So Bill Ripple's paper in 1999, kind of that initial seminal work to identify this possibility on the landscape. And so you can see here that this is the phase that I'm going to talk about mostly today because it's the part that is critical. And the reason it is because most people that support the idea that a trophic cascade happened from a behavioral standpoint would suggest that if it was going to happen, it was going to happen here because there were still so many elk, they were so far above a management objective that it only could have been induced by behavioral responses. It couldn't have been due to a reduction of elk because there still were so many elk. So let's just keep that in mind, that that's why we focus in this kind of core period right here. All right, give you a sense with wolves numbers, what they look like. 1995, they were introduced. And park-wide is the top line, just the northern range population, basically the animals that almost entirely hunt on the northern range. You can see here on the solid line, these little dips here, these are disease outbreaks after the population had reached a peak. All right, so we know what the predator to prey numbers look like. And so given that, it's important to note that there, especially initially, was quite a bit of support for the idea of this behavioral mediated trophic cascade. So Dr. Painter, who we're going to be joined with the panel, I know he's already on. This was work, I believe, from his dissertation there at OSU, and it shows that over time, aspen have regenerated and started to ramp up very quickly. The number of young aspen in the landscape is growing and expanding. All right, so right in line with the BBC type video. So we've got more aspen and bigger aspen on the landscape. Similar, Hawthorne Byers, some work from his dissertation showed that willows are increasing. So this is a ring area, so size of plants before and after wolf reintroduction. One of Bill's papers here talking about the number of beaver colonies found on the northern range. So wolves are introduced, we don't have any beaver colonies, and then rapidly they've increased in numbers. Similarly, this is another paper out of OSU talking about the number of berry-producing plants. Right, again, evidence to support the video itself. And here's a nice graphic that they've produced in that video. And then lastly, here's another, just another example. This is the number of the abundance of birds. And the difference here is in Yellowstone National Park versus the greater GYE. So you can see that there is a number of birds that are cavity nesting birds that seem to be higher in the park, suggestive of an improving ecosystem, if you will. And so all this work is kind of being done. I come in about 2012. That's when I started my PhD. And there's a debate kind of percolating right about that time. And even though there's this evidence coming from multiple different lines of evidence that suggest that this trophic cascade is happening in the park, there's kind of this itch in the back of a lot of ecologists' minds, asking, do we really think an ecosystem is that simple? Can we boil it down to elk are scared of wolves and so they don't eat plants and the plants can grow? And I mean, this is from Mark Hebelwhite's PhD up in Banff National Park, where they saw similar kinds of plant responses in certain cases. And this is a great schematic. You can think about this as the food web that the Trophic Cascade has essentially boiled the system down to in Yellowstone. And this is where ecologists really started to question the simplicity of this model. So as more and more studies really started digging into this question, there a number of caveats and conflicting evidence really started to appear. And so here's just a couple different ones I've pulled. It talks about stream hydrology limiting recovery, dynamics of time and space of wolves, grizzly bears or the abundance of bears are alternative foods. These interactions, all these things are working together to suggest that it's very unlikely in this large terrestrial system of multiple predators and prey that it really could be that simple. And so this is the controversy, if you will, that I kind of walked into for my PhD. One other piece of evidence that, and this is unpublished data, this graph anyway, but the data is part of a lot of data that Eric Larson has collected, who did his PhD at OSU, and has collaborated in the past with Bill and Bob and Luke as well. This is an interesting graph because it even itself starts to question how strong a response of aspen, which is kind of the fundamental plant in this story, if that plant even is recovering and at what level. So throughout the talk, I'm going to refer to this height of 200 centimeters. This is the goalpost, if you will, for an aspen or an aspen in Yellowstone. If you get to 200 centimeters, we assume that you're safe from herbivory. You're tall enough that the elk's not going to browse on you any longer. And you can see here what's interesting is even up until recently, and we do see some outliers. So there's some of these plants that have greatly exceeded these heights. But as a whole, the average of the aspen sucker height in northern Yellowstone is closer to where it started in 1999 than it is to that 200 centimeter height. And so I think that's something to be cognizant of when we go through this talk, that although there appears to be response, there also appears to be very large scale heterogeneity in the response. And as a whole, the population hasn't really recovered. And so we're going to talk about why that may be. All right, and this is just an overview. This is from Laney Bryce. We overlap out of Dan McNulty's lab. This is a preprint that they're working on now. This is just a different way to visualize that data. And this is the same data from that other graph. And it just shows how many plants got to 200 centimeters using two different measurements characteristics. One is primarily the tool or the approach that Luke and Bob and Bill have used. They're at OSU, there's 5 tallest stems, versus just a random sampling of plants within a stand in northern Yellowstone. And what this suggests is it gives kind of a very different impression. Here would suggest that almost, at this point, 70% of the stands have actually reached a point where they're healthy and they're beyond the herbivory of elk. But if we look at just random plants, a random sampling of the landscape, it's a much different story in terms of whether or not aspen have actually truly responded in the system. All right, so like I said, that's the controversy I walked into. And so when I get there, one of the first things that Dan McNulty and I sat down and talked about was how do we tackle this question? Can we actually can we tackle the mechanism? At this point, there'd been very little work examining whether or not elk are actually afraid of wolves. And that's critical, because if a behavioral mediated trophic cascade is to happen, that mechanism has to exist. And so in a lot of ways, it's a big oversight to just assume that it's happening. All right, so in this case, our simple cartoons, wolves come in the system, elk run somewhere else, and our aspen trees grow. That's our cartoon figure of what we're working on. To tackle this question, this is about as heavy of the method slides as I'm going to get. We use a habitat selection analysis. Basically, it's a movement-based RSF, if you're familiar. We focus on 27 adult females that were collared in the early 2000s. These collected data every 5 hours. And the data is from 2001 to 2004. Now, remember, we focus on that period because that's that core time when we actually think if a behavioral mechanism existed, that's when we would have seen it. A lot of wolves, a lot of elk still. And so they could have grazed everything down, but if they didn't, it's because they were scared of the river bottoms, for example. It's also important to note that this is an important population because it is the original population that was the focus of John Landre's seminal Landscape of Fear paper that kind of proposed a lot of these, served as the bedrock for some of these ideas. Like I said, high elk numbers. We also, it's important to note, we only focus on winter with this data. And that's because, for a couple of reasons. Primarily, most of the browse species, aspen and willow, are basically follow this road corridor here. Vast majority of the browse species are on the northern range. Also, this is the only place where elk are overlapping really with browse species during the winter when they're going to be most apt to browse it. So if grass is covered with snow, they're going to eat aspen plants. If grass is available, they're more likely to eat that. And so this is the time of the year that we expect to see a response in a vegetation and thus a behavioral mechanism to be most important. All right, so high browse overlap. All right, so the first thing we did to test this mechanism, to better understand it, was we went back and basically developed 4 different metrics. These are kind of the core metrics that have been used in wolf elk literature to describe fear. Like these are the scary places to be. So predicted kill, so this is basically a model of where we expect kills to happen. This is just a density plot of where the kills were in any given year. Openness, so wolves are chasing cursorial predator. They need big open landscapes to chase down and capture elk. So the red represents the most open areas. So in theory, the most risky places. Blue is forested. And then this is a kind of the traditional metric that's been used in the past, including the original 410 paper that looked at whether or not wolves were scared of, whether elk were scared of wolves, and showed that they were. And he used this measurement of wolf density. All right, now that's kind of the traditional way of thinking about the landscape of fear. There's a static map and it's a spatial representation of risk. But in watching in 20 years of wolf research, the one thing we know from the park, and this largely comes from a lot of my advisor Dan McNulty's PhD work, that showed that wolves are crepuscular. They really only hunt those dawn and dusk periods. So it begs the question, we know elk are intelligent. Do they use that information? How could they use that information? All right, so we were able to collaborate with a good friend and colleague of mine, Matt Metz, with his wolf GPS data from his PhD work, and actually calculate the hourly movement data. How far does a wolf move at any given time? And we can see these are offset a little bit because of how the data are analyzed, but all that matters is that wolves really like to move and hunt in the morning and in the evening. This is data collected from 2004 to 2013, so it's a pretty good overlap. It doesn't change. It doesn't matter what year you look at the data, and we know this pattern exists across the polar Arctic distribution of wolves. All right, so what we did then is, okay, so this is just a simplistic version. We took the kill density one as an example, and we said, okay, this is a scary place. The red place is a bad place. How do elk use a scary place or risky place during safe and risky times? So now we know when this is where the scary places are and when they're scary. So here I'm going to focus in this green area, which is the high activity, the riskiest time, and then this low activity, the safest time. All right, so if we just look at how do elk respond on that landscape, we can look at interesting enough. So across here, kill density. So basically, you're never going to get killed here. This is where you're going to get killed. Probability. How likely are you to use that area? What we see is that at low densities, at safe places, elk don't really care if wolves are hunting or sleeping. But it gets really fascinating when we think about the places that are risky. So if it's a risky place, you're likely to die here. You don't want anything to do with that place. You get the hell out of Dodge when wolves are hunting. But if wolves are sleeping, that's the best place to be. And that's where you want to spend all of your time, or at least that's what elk have made the decision to do, is spend their time there. And this is really interesting because it has implications with Trophic Cascade, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, we took this one step further, and we were able to combine this with our models to recreate the landscape of fear as defined by Landre in that seminal paper. Now, to show you what that looks like, what that does is the landscape of fear is, in essence, a 3D representation, a cognitive map of how you view the landscape. In this case, are you scared of a landscape, scared of a place or not? So we see the red is the exact same from here, and the road, you can see the road curving through it. So in this case, the topographical relief is your avoidance. So if it's a valley, you're selecting for that area. You prefer to be there. Versus if it's a mountain peak, you don't want anything to do with that. You're scared of that place. And we see during these periods of low activity, they're showing they like to be in these high risky places. And when we flip that around, we see that when wolves are hunting, you don't like to be in these locations. Now, the cool thing that happens when we're able to separate the data out on this 24-hour cycle is we can actually go in and visualize how this changes within a 24-hour period. So you see here, once again, we've got a risky place that elk are selecting for, and this is at midnight. So this is wolves are basically sleeping. And then this will progress through here. And you see as the hours change, at nighttime, there's not much change, but when wolves start to wake up and start hunting in dusk, we start to see a dramatic shift in how elk are using the landscape. So we see this strong avoidance of these risky places. Wolves will start to bed down. Elk want to start using that places. It's not risky anymore because the wolves are sleeping. Wolves will start to ramp up their activity. We see a small bump here in how they're using the landscape. And then wolves bed down for the year or for the rest of the night. And this cycles through one more time. But you could imagine what this would, that would look like over and over throughout the 365 days of the year. All right, and so this idea that space and time dictates how elk are using the landscape is important for the Trophic Cascade discussion. So we know that elk avoided these risky places during risky times. But what that also tells us is that, and I don't show it here, but most of the aspen and willow are actually in riskier places. What this says is, in these risky times, it's only about 4 hours of the day. There's 20 hours of the day that elk not only can use, but do and want to use these risky places, which is where the aspen and willow are, suggesting that it's possible and very potentially likely that the elk are not being excluded from these browsing locations, and they can continue to graze there, even though they may move temporarily out of those areas. Because of this would really suggest that if we are seeing a Trophic Cascade in Yellowstone, a plant recovery, it probably is due to numerical effects because these elk are able to access those browse during safe times. All right, now we can zoom that out a little bit. This is a paper that Jeremy Cusack and myself and a number of the collaborators were involved with as part of Jeremy's PhD. One other suggestion has been, well, maybe if elk don't avoid them at an hourly or daily basis, maybe they just pick up and move. They say, I don't want anything to do with that area. I'm going to leave. And so the plants can grow it in that case. And I just grabbed one figure out of there to show this is the distribution of female elk from GPS data and the same types of data, wolf GPS data, to show you that there is massive overlap. Elk have not picked up and moved from places with aspen to places without aspen or willow or what have you. So there doesn't appear to be any direct wolf-induced behavioral mechanism to force a Trophic Cascade. All right. So we can rule out kind of the first potential mechanism. Now, that being said, wolves can still have this same effect, but we have to consider that the world is not this simple. And this in itself is a simplistic vision of Yellowstone, but this gives us a better idea of the complexity that happens in that system. So we have multiple different predators, we have humans, we have different prey, we have different plant species, what have you. So in this more complex system, it is possible that wolves could, in essence, scare elk to death. And how this would happen, so the original landscape of fear, a spatial only model, would suggest this would be how we could visualize the landscape of fear. The predator lives here, the prey goes somewhere else. And in this case of Yellowstone, where another major predator, in this case mountain lions that we're going to talk about, is sitting right here, the wolves scare elk into cougars, cougars kill the elk, we get less elk, we get we get more plants. So this same behavioral mechanism can still occur, but it has to happen in a slightly different way. So this was the next step, is can we evaluate that and see what happens here? All right. So once again, wolves come in, elk run away. This time the mountain lions kill them and our aspen grow. All right, so that's where the next kind of component of my PhD work went. Now, previous to this work, there's kind of been three hypotheses put out about how a prey species like elk would handle a system with multiple predators. The first one is the intermediate or kind of gap hypothesis. You're basically going to set up shop and try and avoid both of them simultaneously. The second one is you go sit on top of the domain where the less lethal predators, whichever one is less likely to or able to kill you, that's where you should hang out. And then most recently has been the idea of this hunting mode hypothesis. So ambush predators, they live in rocky, timbered places. You can tell that's a bad place to be, so you don't hang out with them. Wolves chase you all over the country, so you don't know any time where a wolf's going to kill you, so you have to spend your time with those guys because they're less predictable. But these three hypotheses overlook what we found in my first chapter, which is that prey are not just partitioning the landscape according to risky places. They're also partitioning it according to risky time. And because of competition between predators and other things, we know that many predators separate themselves not only in space, but also in time. And so if we think about this on that daily activity cycle again, we can imagine that we have predator lives out here and a predator lives out here, but they also operate at different times of the day. So one might be a nocturnal hunter, one might be a diurnal hunter. If this does occur, it provides this opening, these avenues for prey to move back and forth, almost in like a figure eight, and avoid both predators simultaneously using space and time. And so that's what we were interested to look at, see what happens based on what we know about the biology of wolves and cougars. All right, so same kind of metrics, spatial predation risk, daily predation risk. So this is GPS data. In this case, I'm going to focus on openness and see if wolves and cougars and elk all kind of just run back and forth across the landscape as elk avoid these guys. So the question is, do elk select for these predator domain vacancies is what we've termed it. So the first thing we had to do is figure out, do wolves and cougars actually partition their resources? And we see very clearly, as expected, cougars like to hunt in intermediate timber and dense timber. Wolves like to hunt out in the open. Okay, nothing novel there, if you will. We expect that. Also, because of what we know about the biology of two species, we know that they also, and we found in Yellowstone as well, that cougars and wolves operate at different times of the day. So this is the activity rate from GPS collared cougars. We see that cougars are basically, here's the nighttime. They're basically, cougars are hunting at night. Wolves are, you've seen this figure already, wolves are hunting during those dawn and dusk periods. So there's times when they are separate. All right, so now we've confirmed that wolves and cougars operate in different predator domains, both in space and time. So there are these these domain vacancies, these opportunities for elk to still move across the landscape and not and access all of their resources. All right, so we'll walk you through. I'll walk you through step by step how we build this relationship and evaluate it. So the first thing that we did is I'll show you here. So we've got openness, same thing you've seen, time of day. So the black here is nighttime. The gray bars would be those dawn and dusk periods, and then daytime up here. So here is the cougar activity schedule. They're active at night, and they kill mostly in this intermediate area. We can use those two parameters to calculate basically the domain riskiness or the likelihood of where and when a cougar is going to kill an elk. And what that looks like here is the riskiest place and time to be a elk when they're thinking about cougar predation is right here. So 3 a.m. at 169, 170 openness, somewhere in there. And then there's bigger and bigger areas that are of riskiness that become less and less risky. We can do the same thing for wolves and overlay their time and space covariates. And of course, with wolves, we get two kind of core periods. We get a dusk hunting period and a dawn hunting period. The dusk one is stronger, but you can see these guys are partitioned basically on the landscape. And then lastly, we can actually look at elk selection of those landscapes and overlay those predator hunting domains on top of that to see, are elk actually making pretty good decisions? We see they very strongly avoid wolves in that dawn period in open areas. They don't really care about the wolves at the dusk period. Wolves aren't super active, about half the activity level. And then similarly, we don't expect, elk aren't spending all their time out here, but that's also, remember, this is winter. They don't want to starve to death. So they're avoiding the most risk. They're selecting for the green is the selection. They're selecting for the places that are quite a ways away from the peak cougar activity schedule. And then here, they're actually going into the timber despite a less reduction in food quality to avoid wolves. So they are kind of using this figure eight premise that we thought they might. So we see this hypothetical example applies here in Yellowstone. And it shows that elk don't run from, the big wolf and just get eaten by cougars. There's not this secondary facilitation, this predator facilitation that would lead to the opportunity for a trophic cascade. Not only because cougars aren't going to necessarily increase and reduce the predation level, but also because elk can keep running back and forth, they can keep acquiring those resources. They can spend time in those riparian browse areas, especially at night, and really hammer those areas. So once again, this would suggest they have access to them, and that any of this response that we might see in plant communities was likely due to a demographic driver. All right, so we ruled out basically predator facilitation. All right, so if it's not fear and we're seeing a trophic cascade, then what's causing it? Well, the next step is to evaluate whether or not wolves just killed a bunch of elk and we have less elk, and so that's why the plants grow. All right, so that would be our traditional numerical density mediated effect. So we tried to tackle this in my last chapter of my dissertation. We use a variety of different analyses to kind of get at it and look at it from a number of different angles. So to do this, what we did is we broke the northern range into what actually is pretty decent representation of most of the elk either hang up in this upper part of the northern range or this lower part of the northern range. And so we use that topographic feature to delineate the population and look at differences between the two areas. So the first thing that we see very quickly is that the decline in elk is almost entirely driven by a reduction in elk in the upper areas. Now it's important to note, if I go back, this also is where the higher density of wolves are. And it's also hot, heavier duty winter. It's just harder to make it up in the upper regions. So we see the lower sector really hasn't changed that much. But the upper sector really has driven this population decline on the northern range. We also see there's a large difference in calf-cow ratios. And so this is some work by Lacey Smith as part of her dissertation. We can see the upper sector, if we're managing for elk, I'd say most people would say their goal is right here. We want to somewhere keep around 30 calves per 100 cows. We've been below that for a long time in the upper sector, meaning that we just don't have any more calves coming into the population. A lot more variability here in the lower sector. Now, there's also another important part, and this is Lacey's dissertation as well, that in the upper, there's differential mortality between these two areas. The upper sector animals are much more likely to get killed by a wolf, and that increases as they age. So you have a population that has less calves coming into it, and so the population is naturally aging, and those elk are just more likely to get killed up there, probably because of maybe harder winter conditions, better hunting conditions for wolves. All these factors together contribute to a large difference in the age structure of the population. This is some stuff from Sarah Hoyt's PhD or postdoc, I can't remember which, at Michigan Tech. And so you can see that lower sector has aged a little bit. This is the percent of all elk that are over 12 years old. But the upper sector in about 2004 took a dramatic shift. And so now we have, and 12 years old is important because that's the point when elk become very, very vulnerable to wolf predation. So now we have no recruitment and a population that's aging very quickly. And we know that the elk in the upper sector are much more likely to get killed by wolves. And so we have this positive feedback loop that is increasing and increasing, leading to a further reduction in the elk numbers in the upper sector. All right, so this does point to evidence that there can be a numerical effect. There could be wolves driving down the numbers of elk that would contribute to a plant response, a trophic cascade. The question becomes, are wolves solely responsible, or how much might wolves be responsible for this? Because that's important to know. If we restore wolves to Scotland, for example, how many wolves would we need to reduce the red deer population or roe deer or what have you to restore an ecosystem? Well, a lot of other things are happening when wolves get returned that really muddy the waters. So the first thing is, remember, we've got all these other predators in the system. So when wolves are reintroduced, grizzly bear numbers are increasing throughout the entire system. Similarly, we know we probably have peak or near the peak of the cougar population at that point finally. And both of these animals are really, really good at killing calves, for elk calves. Also important to note that grizzly bears and where elk hang out kill different segments of the population in the summer where those grizzly bears are killing those calves. And so that might influence and drive those populations, those lower sector down more quickly because of where grizzly bears operate in the summer. Cougars also, if they're killing elk, the vast majority of the elk that they're killing is these calves. So they're very, very efficient at that. So these both are having impacts on the population. So we've got bears and cougars increasing. We also have a late hunt on the that is initiated in the late 70s, early 80s. This is a human harvest of adult females, well, any females, outside the park in an effort to reduce the population of elk. So basically, we can't shoot them inside the park. Can we maybe shoot them outside the park and bring these elk population back down to maybe something that's more ecologically sustainable? This is where it gets very complicated, if you will, because as much as we may not admit it or think of it, humans are really, really good at picking the fat, healthy elk out of a herd of animals. So what you're seeing here is a ton of data over time. And first thing, this is a percentage of kills. This is elk age right here. This is the secondary axis, the line in the dots, elk pregnancy rate. So what we see is that humans are killing mostly 3 to 7-year-old elk. These are prime age elk that are very important in terms of their contribution to the population. what we see here is, of course, the pregnancy rate. So about 12 years old, pregnancy rate starts to rapidly decline. And so humans are killing the best of the best in terms of our of what we'd expect to contribute to the elk numbers. This is very different from what wolves are killing on the northern range. And so here's the same graph, but with wolves overlaid, and you can see that wolves are mostly killing stuff out here 12 years old and older. Elk that are very unlikely to be pregnant every year. So wolves not having maybe as big effect as humans are in terms of that. This is an important to note simply because here's when wolves are introduced. This is the number of total hunter killed elk outside the park. We still killed a lot of elk for a long time after wolves were reintroduced to the system, which basically you can think of adding to that positive snowball feedback effect. So we're driving the population down very, very quickly because the animals that are a big proportion of animals that are getting killed outside the park by humans would have been pregnant and would have produced calves. All right, so now we've got bears, we've got humans. The last big kind of wrinkle in this is that when wolves were introduced, it was kind of the start of a long period of drought conditions on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So here, 0, Palmer Drought Severity Index, this would be average conditions in a given year. The Dust Bowl, you can see, was very dry. This would be the 88 fires from Yellowstone. And you can see, after wolves were introduced, we had a huge snow year in 1996. Wolves were able to kill 2 and 3 elk at a time. They saw triple kills, actually. But then after that, we had a lot of pretty significant drought years, which means that in the summer months, there's not a lot of forage out there. Elk can't put on fat, which means they're less likely, or they may be more likely to abort their fetus, or they're going to produce lower weight calves that are more likely to get killed. So as you can see, reintroducing wolves right here was probably the worst case scenario in trying to figure out how exactly much wolves might be responsible for any kind of demographic response. All right, so wrapping all that up, I guess, conclusions. So what I hope I've shown you is that this adaptive foraging probably helps explain heterogeneity in browse recovery. Browse recovery is very sporadic across the northern range. And this behavioral response really helps explain why we might see a strong local spatial response. So if you're out there and you see a wolf chasing an elk and it runs 2 miles, this helps us match that observation up with the idea that wolves can still have weak, large-scale ecological effects because the elk are just going to circle back around and come right back there. Once again, leads to the suggestion, the conclusion that this ecological effect in Yellowstone, if it is occurring from a trophic cascade standpoint, probably is coming from a numerical effect. And more importantly, wolves are only part of the drivers of that numerical effect. All right, so there's multiple factors occurring: the drought, the humans, multiple predators. And a lot of these conditions were happening before and after wolf introduction, so it's really hard to tie wolves directly to these impacts if they are occurring. And I would argue that that means that this exclusive focus on wolves as a restoration tool, and particularly in Yellowstone, is really misleading. All right, so I've got about, I'm a little bit over, I'll probably wrap up in about 5 minutes here quick. So this begs the question, I guess, coming back to the theme of that video, can even a little small wolf effect change a river? Can it change the ecosystem to such a level that it's all we really needed? And there could potentially be that argument. Are wolves enough that they were the last thing that tipped the balance and drove this system, these population declines, that in combination is what contributed to potentially a system that's on the path toward recovery? And there's data that might suggest that. Like I said, remember this sporadic events where there are individual plants that are taking off. Once again, I would argue that as a population whole across the northern range, we haven't seen much recovery. It's still blunted. And there's probably a really good reason for that that wolves just can't overcome, at least not in the short term. All right, so we go to our stable state tipping point example, and we think about, if this was the ecological system before wolves were extirpated, and the system had evolved for 12,000 years toward this equilibrium. We remove wolves from the system. That system, the elk grows population-wise very rapidly. It enters an alternative state, and now it becomes incredibly difficult for the system to revert back, for that ball to jump out of the cup and go back to where it was. Can we put the cat back in the bag, basically? And a lot of the work from the riparian systems would suggest it isn't very simple to do that. So here's a great set of pictures. Beaver Dam on the same, I believe this is Elk Creek. You can see in 1923, Beaver Dam's large, wide river corridor. Wolves are extirpated, beavers leave the system. And now here's where you can see that tree back there. You can see this is where the dam used to be. Now we have a very deeply incised channel. It doesn't matter if beavers come back into the system. It's going to be really hard to dam that up, keep the dam there long enough, allow vegetation and stuff to come in and to restore that ecosystem. All right, I'm going to steal, if you will, a little bit from Tom Hobbs's lab at Colorado State to talk on the willow side about this, because they had one of the most phenomenal studies I've ever seen in a national park, or really anywhere, to really test this idea. So once again, we've got this 200 centimeter height that we're interested in. All right, so they went out and they measured a bunch of willow plants to see over time how tall were the willows getting. And this is places where elk could graze whenever and however they wanted. We see there really hasn't been much change. However, we do start to see a change when they went in and they constructed these dams, these fake beaver dams that basically raised the water table. They, as Tom says, got the willows' feet wet. And we see that does help the plant recovery. They also excluded herbivory. So they put up big exposures so no elk could get in there and say, okay, if we cut out herbivory or we feed more water to the willows, do we see recovery? We see an improvement. We still don't see full recovery. It's not until you combine these constructions inside of an exclosure, so you get rid of elk herbivory and you basically restore the water table, that you actually see full plant recoveries, suggesting that it is more than just wolves scaring elk or producing elk population. There's other factors that have contributed that we need to think about restoring if we're actually going to restore the system. To me, this is kind of the nail in the coffin that suggests that we can go in the right direction, but there's a lot more that has to be done if we are actually going to what we hope or what we think we can do it and restore an ecosystem, similar to like that video has suggested. All right, so I would argue wolves are simply not enough to induce this trophic cascade. I would argue that this really does serve as a cautionary tale, the idea that a small number of wolves can have this massive impact. There's other reasons to restore wolves, aesthetics, restoring a predator. There's lots of reasons to it. I think we need to be very cautious of whether or not we claim that ecological restoration, or at least rapid ecological restoration, is one of the justifications for it. So with that, this is 25 years of data from lots of different partners, acknowledge a ton of different funders and things like that. Yeah, I'd love to say thank you. I'll turn over to Jessica quick. I don't know how we're going to do this, if we're going to take a couple minute break or what, or that. So.
Well, so there's probably up with questions that we're getting from here and maybe what you and the panel will be discussing. So how are you feeling? Would you like a quick break and then we can jump straight into the panel discussion, and then Luke and Bob can answer questions with you and you guys can talk about them together?
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the questions. Yeah, I think let's take a 5-minute break or so, and then because some of these some of the like the sucker height stuff and a lot of the plant stuff, Luke and Bob would be better suited to talk to those, and yeah, we'll kind of go from there. I think that sounds like a good idea to me. So
Okay, great. We'll meet back at around 5:10. Does that sound good?
All right, perfect.
Jessica, did you say 10 minutes?
Hey, Luke, I think she said 5 minutes, maybe right around 5:10. You can start your video if you like.
Yeah, 5:10, I think. Come back.
Okay, I'll pick it up in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, I think we might start coming back. Whoever did the music for the Jeopardy music, Amanda or Tall, that was good.
Here to help.
Yeah, so
I was good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you, Michael. It's been a while.
Yeah.
That was a great presentation, Michael. I just reread those papers, and I actually hadn't read the 2019 paper with the Cougar stuff. I just read that in your dissertation, so it was really good to see that. It was some really interesting results that you had in that work.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Luke.
To me, that was the standout from the whole thing, was that putting together the Cougars and the Wolves and the
It was definitely the most. It was definitely the most interesting. I thought it was the coolest part of my dissertation. It doesn't get cited as much as the first one, the monograph, for whatever reason, but.
Yeah, well, it's just I looked in the monograph again, and I was like, oh wait, where's the Cougars? You know, and I was like, oh, it's in this other paper, and just the way that you're showing how the elk are working around the two predators and changing their behavior in that way is just, I mean, I feel like that's a big advance of this kind of science to get to that point, because you know, just to elucidate that behavior is very interesting.
Oh, thank you. All right, Jessica, you want to moderate, I guess?
Yeah, I guess before we get started, Colton, do you want to introduce our two other panelists?
Yeah, so joining us, we have Dr. Luke Painter, who's a senior instructor at Oregon State University. His research is focused primarily on the ecology of animal and plant interactions, particularly Trophic Cascade and the effects of large herbivores and top predators. He received his PhD at Oregon State University in 2013, looking at Trophic Cascades in particular in Yellowstone. And since then, he's published 8 papers on the Yellowstone ecosystem, if I'm not mistaken. And joining him is also Dr. Bob Beshta, who's a professor emeritus at Oregon State University, where he's been for nearly 45 years now in the Forest Ecosystems and Society Department. He's been working in the Yellowstone area since 2003 and has authored or co-authored over 20 papers in that system, looking at the effects of wolf absence and presence on plant communities as well as on streams. So I think we want to start going through the questions now, or?
Yeah, and just a reminder for to keep questions coming, go ahead and just use that Q&A button, and yeah, we'll keep this rolling. Colton, do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of combine 2 of these. If someone could just define aspen sucker height real quick, and then someone else was asking if there were any other metrics that you might consider for aspen regeneration other than just sucker height, like plants per square per unit of area.
Aspen sucker height. That's just the height from the ground to the top of a plant that comes out of the ground. Usually suckers come out of the roots of aspen. Aspen is prolific for putting up sprouts. And so when one of those comes out of the ground, that would be the initiation of a sucker. And in the first year, it might grow 20 centimeters or so. And if unbrowsed, the next year, it might grow 30 or 40 centimeters. And the following year, it might grow 40 or 50 centimeters as it gets higher up. And so an unbrowsed aspen sucker can reach this 200 centimeters magic level in 4 or 5 years if it's not browsed. If it's heavily browsed, it'll never get to 200 centimeters.
I guess to kind of keep on that track, Tall asks, how do you interpret the data showing a small change in average aspen height? Where is there agreement versus disagreement about what's happening?
Well, I could take that one. Or Bob, you want to go ahead?
Go ahead, Luke. I will chime in whatever you might miss.
Okay, so yeah, I think there's kind of some misunderstanding about how to assess, or at least some disagreement about how to assess aspen recovery, or what it means to look at the mean versus the leading edge of height of these aspen suckers that we're talking about. And both quantities are meaningful in informing what's going on there. And in my work, I actually used both. I measured the average height as well as what quantity that Bill and Bob had developed, the 5 tallest young aspen or suckers in a stand. And that, when they started doing this work, that was actually very useful because there weren't any tall ones. And so if you saw any of them at all, that was significant. And it showed that there was something happening. And so it was a way to show this early changes that were going on that were real compared to this completely empty background. Now, if you just had a few aspen suckers showing up here and there, tall and in a mix, that wouldn't mean very much. But in this case, it meant a lot. But then the other thing to note, though, is that the average measurement is showing that the average is lagging behind these taller ones that are taking off. So it's not been a uniform increase, but aspen recruitment doesn't really work that way. So if you have a stand where maybe there's some browsing going on, but it's not so much that it suppresses everything, then you're going to get a mix of heights. And the fact that there are still some short ones doesn't mean that those tall ones are insignificant. They're still growing up and becoming trees and replacing the overstory of that stand, even if some of the short ones don't make it. So I think both of those are informative. And what we're seeing is actually that some stands are doing really well and others aren't. Like Michael said, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the response of plants. This in itself is a huge change over what was happening in the 80s and 90s, where we had uniform suppression of all these aspen sucker by intensive elk browsing. It was pretty much everywhere. So the fact that we're seeing variability is what we'd expect in a trophic cascade situation, that the browsing would diminish and would be somewhat would have heterogeneity on the landscape. So we are seeing that. And the other thing that Bob's probably going to want to talk about more is, and this goes along with Michael's point about a complex system, is that the fact that there's another large herbivore there, the bison, has become an important part of the story that wasn't really appreciated early on because their numbers were low. Their numbers have increased, and they now actually have been suppressing the aspen and willows in some parts of the northern range where they have high density. So I'll just stop there. I don't want to go on too long.
Yeah, let me just quickly add on. Luke pretty well covered it, but a real quick point. Early on, Bill and I picked the 5 tallest aspen in a stand as something we could measure. And we did that because we could be very consistent. It was an easy measurement, and it was what we called a leading edge response. Now, the average number of sprouts in an aspen stand can number thousands, literally thousands. But when we start to see 2 or 3 or 4 beginning to move up, something was happening. At least that was our hypothesis. And we've continued with that for the last 15, 20 years. And it pretty well is borne out that once these plants, these ones started increasing in height, and even though the averages weren't doing much, they started going up. And the increases were always associated with a decrease in browsing. Wasn't climate, wasn't anything else. It's just browsing dropped on those and they began to go up. And so this leading edge is a small portion of the overall number of stems in an aspen stand and does not totally represent the stand because the average, as Luke indicates, lags. And then the other point is, and again, Luke mentioned this, but those graphs of Eric Larson's, which the average has not come up very far, it started out at, let's say, average of 40 centimeters. The average is now up to 100 centimeters. If we did not have 4,000 bison in the northern range of Yellowstone today, that average, I would guess, would be a lot higher. So, when I look at those numbers, I accept what Eric has collected and all that. But my interpretation is not because wolves aren't effective. My interpretation is wolves indeed are effective, except they're not effective on bison.
Yeah, and I think that's one point to your point, Lucas. Oh yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's massive heterogeneity. If everything looked like Crystal Creek, we'd all be jumping up and down, right? Like there's places that have phenomenal recovery, and then you have places like Slough Creek and stuff that just literally nothing's happened, right? And it's just, and I think part of it is some of these river corridors have been so degraded over those 80 years or whatever. But the bison thing, I think, is a huge part of this story. And it was interesting. I think it was during my comps or whatever. One time I went through and did like a back of the envelope calculation, and basically the total AUM, animal unit months or grazing offtake, if you will, on the landscape is about the same now as it was when there were 20,000 elk. But it's just been, you replace 15,000 elk with 3,000 extra bison, and it's the same amount of amount of food you got to provide on the landscape. So I think that question about bison is really kind of the next big piece of the puzzle. So
should we just keep going through the questions, or do you want us to continue discussing? Or maybe looks like there's about 10 questions. Maybe we should keep going through them.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question to Michael. What are the limitations of using kill density as a risk metric? And if elk respond behaviorally to avoid the riskiest places, wouldn't you rarely see kills there?
So yeah, what was interesting about that, so one thing that was really critical about that analysis was, as far as I know, it's probably, as best as I know, it's really the first time that anybody's rigorously applied multiple metrics to figure out what the response looks like in an analysis like this. Remington Mall's paper basically highlights the importance of this and why we need to do it. But in doing that, which was really interesting, was that we saw two important things come out of that analysis. The first of which, it didn't matter if we used kill density or openness or kill model, the kill probability model. The outcome or the response, in essence, the predictability, even the model fit, was almost identical. The only one that performs very, very poorly is wolf density. And what's interesting about that is that's the model that has historically been used, and importantly, that was the one that Daniel Fortin used originally in that model that did suggest that there was a mechanism for the behavioral mediated trophic cascade. What's interesting about that is, and we have my data is all of the same data analyzed the same way that Daniel did, that he analyzed his, but then there's 2 more years of data that got added onto that. I think it was Daniel's part of his postdoc that he did that for. What's interesting about that model is that when we analyzed all 4 years of that period of GPS data, there was actually a positive response of wolves, or of elk selection for wolf density. So that would suggest that elk like to be by wolves, and so there's probably something that's not functioning the way we think it should, or it doesn't represent what we think it should in terms of elk ecology. I mean, it probably has to do with the pack structure. We know there's these gaps where wolves, territorial boundaries, and elk actually is really safe to be between the territories because the wolves are so worried about themselves that they don't really worry about the elk, perhaps, possibly. So what I'd say is, yeah, wolf density was a really bad metric. Kill density was just as good as openness and kill probability. We used kill density for that visualization because it was the easiest and clearest to demonstrate the change over time rather than having openness with pockets all over fluctuating. It was more of a display purposes, but it explained elk behavior just as well as the more complex models.
Okay, do you, Luke, or?
Well, what I always wondered about that wolf density stuff was, don't the wolves want to be where the elk are? So it seems like there's their natural tendency to go where the elk are is going to kind of override some of that avoidance behavior, right?
Yes and no, but wolves are so territorial. As my buddy Matt Metz would say, wolves have 2 objectives in life. It's to eat and breed. But part of that breeding means you have to maintain your territory. And so they spend a lot of time fighting. The number one cause of, and I see Brenna asked a question on here, so I assume Kira might be on here as well too, but part of Kira's master's work showed that the number one cause of wolf mortality in the park is other wolves. So they spend a lot of time fighting with each other and maintaining those territories. And so even though they need to be where the elk are, they're preoccupied a lot of the time too. So, and I will add, I guess too, that related to that wolf density metrics are pretty large scale. And just showing the dial activity stuff, elk can really do fine scale behaviors and just kind of work around, not even just within 24 hours, but just within, an hour or something. They might get chased and they might come right back. And so they're able to avoid wolves at a very fine scale, even though wolves are occupying this larger area. So elk can just work within that whole wolf territory pretty easily. And for most elk, there's no reason to be scared of wolves. You're very unlikely to get killed by them. Wolves are actually pretty terrible predators in terms of their efficiency. And so your per capita risk as an individual elk is really low.
I did have a related question to this about the wolf density thing. So when you were talking about the large scale, you had one slide about the large scale movement possibilities. And I think you were trying to show that the wolves are everywhere, so it didn't make any difference. Like there was wolf hits all over your northern range map. But then later on, you were saying, what I know is true is that the wolf densities are higher in the park, and that the killing of elk is greater. There's more elk killed in the park than there is in that northern range part out of the park, the northern sector, or whatever you're calling it, the lower sector. There's less elk killed there. And I think what's going on partly is that even though there's a lot of elk and a lot of wolves in that part north of the park, the elk are in that valley where all the people are. And the wolf density is not as great there. So it seems, I mean, I'm just speculating, but I think that, isn't it true that I think you actually said this in your presentation, that the kill rates and the wolf densities are much higher in the park than they are in that other sector?
I don't know if the kill rates are different, but there are higher density of wolves, yes, in the upper sector, and your probability of wolf cause mortality is higher in the upper sector.
That's what I meant, yeah.
But what's important to note about that fact is that by and large, the number of elk in the lower sector has not changed in terms of the scale of 20,000 elk. Those numbers have been pretty consistent.
And the recruitment's been higher.
The recruitment has been high enough to replace any mortality.
Yeah.
It's misleading when you see numbers like 80% of the population of elk used to be in the upper sector, and now 80% is in the lower sector or outside the park. That's misleading because the numbers outside the park really have never changed. It's just that the population inside the park has dropped so quickly that it's just a lever that, from a proportional standpoint. And so what that graph that I showed of Jeremy Kusak's, all I was trying to show is that there's a lot of elk there. The wolves are still there. None of the wolves just picked up and went, I'm going from Tower Junction and I'm going to go and leave the park to Dome Mountain and never come back. I have another part that I didn't show in my dissertation chapter that showed that there's very little downstream movement of elk. They're not picking up and just leaving to get away from that higher density of wolves. It's basically that they're getting killed off in the upper parts of the park.
So I appreciate that, but I think we're in danger of oversimplifying that part. Like in the attempt to push back against the oversimplification of the Trophic Cascade thing, I think we're in danger of oversimplifying that because, for example, you're cited in one of those papers, White, 2010, where he was tracking the elk migration or the elk over a few years, female elk, and found that most of them had high fidelity to their winter range. They weren't leaving and going out of the park. Well, that's true, but actually a fairly substantial proportion of them did shift their range. And we know that they do this even under other circumstances, not just wolves. And so, and this was also found to happen with the central herd, some of them shifting outside the park. So it seems to me that if say, for example, White found like 40% of them did move, but maybe some of them didn't move very far. Maybe they didn't all go out of the park. So maybe it's only like 10%, they actually shifted to a different range. Well, if you have 6,000 elk, that's 600 elk that shifted. If they do that over several years, you could get 1,000 elk that ended up shifting their range outside the park during this period of time based on those numbers. So I think I don't want to see it get oversimplified the other way either.
No, I totally agree. And I mean, you and I have had this conversation about, I'm not one to say that there isn't a behavioral component to this. Wolves are definitely having a behavioral effect on elk populations. I think it's I think it's much more driven by demographics than it is behavior. And I agree. Even in that last chapter of my dissertation, we looked at that home range fidelity, and we see that there are movements downstream. What's interesting is that basically, just like what PJ showed in his paper, the vast majority of them, they're coming back to the exact same spot. But there are some of them that move. I had out of, like, I don't remember how many, maybe out of 60 elk or something, like 3 or 4 move pretty substantial distance, maybe more than 5 kilometers. But the vast majority of them stayed. And so there is a small component that are moving further and further down river. It's not a big component, but it does exist. But if you're, what I would argue is that if your probability of a 12-year-old elk, which is what about half the population in the upper sector is now, has a 30% probability of being killed by wolves, that's going to drive that decline faster than 10% of those elk or 5% of those elk maybe moving a couple kilometers every year.
Yeah, and I think that points out another thing that complicates this whole story, which is that the demographics of the elk population has changed during this whole study period since the wolves were reintroduced, and also they were naive prey there at the beginning when the wolves came in. So possibly the behavior response may not have been the same the whole time that this has been going on, as well as the fact that many of them were starving at first, and now they're not so much under pressure for food resources.
I have another question from Jeremy Brooks, and I want to be sure to have this answered because he was at the lunch earlier today. Michael, elk have been shown to be able to change their behavior in response to landscapes with multiple threats that are dynamic over time and space. Cow elk in particular have been shown to become bulletproof as they get older, as they learn to alter their habitat selection and movement patterns according to multiple perceived risks from predators. However, the rate at which they learn, the mechanism for how they learn, and the degree to which that information is culturally transmitted between individuals is largely unknown. What are your thoughts on how the timing of your research, the focus on wintertime activity, and the focus on how cow, not bull elk may influence your conclusions?
Yeah, and it's actually, I'm glad you brought this question because I hadn't actually thought of this in this context, Jeremy. So that Thurfeld paper, that bulletproof paper, it's actually really interesting. I hadn't really put it in the context of the Yellowstone system, but what all of a sudden just jumps to mind to me is, I wonder if that study actually shows that elk are bulletproof, or if humans just don't like to shoot old scraggly elk. And I'm curious how, or maybe I'm thinking about it in the reverse, and it is that they learn to be bulletproof. I don't know, but I've always thought of this system, the data we see in Yellowstone, as what the human harvested elk of, like, basically 2 to 7 is what they're going to kill, as humans are really good at picking out a fat elk. That paper would argue that it's just that they get smarter over time, and so it's interesting to think about that. And because I think that has implications for your question about, how much of it's learned versus how much it might be that humans are better at this than we kind of give ourselves credit for potentially. Bypassing that, I guess, but more focused just directly on your question, then timing of the research, the focus on winter activity, and the focus on cows. So yeah, cows and bulls do incredibly different things in Yellowstone. So we don't have good data really at all on bulls. That's partly a social reason. People get finicky when you put collars on animals that they want to take lots of pictures of, and so that's one of the reasons we don't really get to put collars on bull elk, because it might ruin good pictures. It's the same reason we don't collar more wolves than we do, because people don't want to take pictures of wolves with collars. They'd rather take pictures. They'd rather use collars to find wolves, to take pictures of the wolf next to it that doesn't have a collar on it, if that makes sense. So, so we can't really talk about bull behavior. That being said, we do focus on cows, largely because that's the largest proportion of the population, and also because it's the demographic driver of elk herds. And so if we know what they're doing, that's going to give us good guidance on the population response to whatever we're asking questions about. The research, the timing of the research, I think, as I alluded to in the talk, we focused on there, one, because that was when a good chunk of data was collected, but also I think it is just such a critical time. That's when this behavioral mechanism, if we were going to pick it up anywhere in our data, that's when it should have been the most likely for us to identify it, because elk populations were still way above carrying capacity, and we had a lot. We were at the peak wolves. So the conditions, those two conditions together are the period that if we were going to see a behavioral mechanism at any point, that's when we would have seen it. So, and was it enough time? I think so. If we think about it in the context of, and my last chapter, we break this into, I have data from the late 80s, early 90s, so pre-wolf, and what I call peak wolf, and then I have like 2012 to 2016, which is kind of like stabilized lower wolves, lower elk. And when I think about it in that context of like, it's a good enough amount of data to give us a snapshot of what happened during that core period that we're really interested in. So yeah, I think there's enough data there for that. I don't know if that really answers your question, but and I guess, you know, you're asking more about learning behavior, and so maybe you're asking about naive elk. Naive elk might have happened for about a year, but as PJ White, who retired from YCR, told me one time, like these wolves were kids in a candy store when they got let out of a cage. That first year or two, these elk had never seen a wolf in 80 years. There was 4 feet of snow, and wolves could kill 2 or 3 of them at a time. Elk learned real fast that was a bad thing to be around. So I think there was enough time between the reintroduction for them to have that learned behavior. And I think there was enough data collection over 3 years or 4 years to actually understand what was happening there.
I have another question from Marie Tosa. She says the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is very unique in many ways. For example, having multiple large predators, and multiple herbivores out there. So how applicable are the results from this area to other parts of North America?
Can I?
Yeah, Bob, you or Luke want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, let me jump in. Bill and I and Eric Larson started in the late 1990s, and Bill and I in the early 2000s. We started looking at what was going on in Yellowstone. And we began to see things happening there. We began to put together the history. And we know that before wolves came in, plant communities were being heavily hammered in the absence of wolves. And cougar were gone for a bit too, but cougar came back, bears were back, and yet plant communities were just being toasted by elk, whether you're an aspen, a cottonwood, a berry producing shrub, whatever, or a willow, nothing could grow. So the question is, well, Yellowstone is this interesting place. Is it unique, or does it occur elsewhere? So we got onto a little bit of a journey going to national parks. We went to Jasper, we went to Olympic, we went to Wind Cave, we went to Zion, and we went to Yosemite. And interesting enough, in every one of those, when the apex or a large predator, the dominant one, either was pushed out of the system or extirpated, the native ungulate took over, and plant communities had the same, were experiencing the same effects we saw in Yellowstone. So we replicated this story. 6 different parks, same thing. Get rid of the apex predator, and you see the native ungulates take over. So then we started watching what was going on in Yellowstone. We started seeing recovery of plant communities since the reintroduction of wolves. And we have not studied other national parks looking at reintroductions, but the work coming out of Jasper and Banff began to corroborate a similar kind of response. Aspen doing better in those systems up there too. So yeah, Yellowstone's this interesting place, but I think what we're seeing there, at least in a broad sense, is consistent with what we've seen in other places. And so, you know, Michael, at the end, if I was looking at your talk for the first time coming into this, and you came to the conclusion that wolves are not enough, my sense is that wolves were the necessary component to change things, because can you imagine what Yellowstone Northern Range would look like today had wolves not come back? How tall would the aspen be? 40 centimeters? That's what they were before wolves came back. Today we're seeing aspen pushing over 200 centimeters in a lot of places. We're seeing willows coming back in a lot of places. We're seeing cottonwoods coming back in some places. Again, this bison issue keeps staring us in the face because there's so many bison now that have replaced the effects of elk. Even though elk numbers have dropped in the Northern Range, bison are back. But I just can't imagine how you would have seen any recovery of any plant communities had you not brought wolves back. And so when you say wolves are not enough, I'm not sure what to do with that. But it feels to me like it really misrepresents what's been going on inside the park.
Can I ask, just as a follow-up, do we know specifically more about the history of like mountain lions in the area and grizzly bears? Like, when did those numbers start going back up or decreasing?
Michael would know better than I would.
Yeah.
Yeah, so grizzly bears, we've always had a really good grizzly bear population through the 60s and stuff, and the 70s, and then they shut down the dumps, or the garbage dumps, so that people couldn't sit in their station wagon and feed grizzly bears out of their back seat. When that happened, we ended up killing, or well, not me, but the park ended up killing a lot of grizzly bears and actually reduced the population very quickly because they were all habituated to food and they didn't want grizzly bears climbing into people's tents. So grizzly bear population was forcibly reduced, and then it's slowly been climbing. They have a very, very slow growth rate. But now they're probably, I mean, most people would argue they're at full carrying capacity. Cougars were increasing throughout that whole time. The first cougar study in the park was in the late 80s and early 90s. And then again, they replicated again in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then we're replicating a third time right now, or wrapping that up. From all we can tell is that cougars are probably at carrying capacity now. They probably got there in the about the same time wolves were introduced. So we have a full suite of predators probably at carrying capacity in Yellowstone. So to answer, and to Bob, your question, yeah, I totally agree. I know you guys' paper from the parks. So the first thing I'll tackle with that is John Vucevich's 2005 or so paper, when he modeled elk population dynamics in Yellowstone. What he showed very clearly is that the human harvest is basically the super predator in that system at that time. And his model showed that elk populations would have declined regardless of their introduction of wolves. Wolves sped up the process. They are responsible for about 10% of the decline in that paper, in that modeling exercise. And so I'm not arguing that wolves didn't have any effect. What I would say is that, to your point, I think the system would have still continued on the trajectory it was going on if we hadn't restored wolves, and also maintained the hunt, which I would expect we would have done without wolves, maintain the hunt outside the park, because that population was declining, and what's interesting to note, and most people don't realize, is, and it's hard to say how accurate the counts are, but the population of elk actually started declining like 2 years before wolves were introduced. That trajectory had changed. And so I'm not saying that wolves aren't responsible. I do think, but I think they've sped up the process. Now, as for the bigger question of whether or not, how useful is this information, like, and you hit right on it, Robert, that, or Bob, sorry, I see your name, I see your spelling there, okay. And I keep calling it Robert. I think these effects can happen in parks. I think Yellowstone National Park is a great example of where this can happen. We see this in Banff National Park. We've seen this with aspen with Banff. I think when I approach this subject, though, I'm thinking about it from a broader context is, do we expect restoring wolves to human-dominated landscapes? Will we see a trophic cascade? And I forget the author of the paper, but it's the one that they did basically a comparison. They compared cattle, ranching, or inside and outside of Jasper and Banff and stuff like that. And they showed that in human-dominated landscapes, wolves are irrelevant. We so manipulate the system that restoring a large predator cannot swamp humans' ecological impacts. Because we control harvest of the large ungulates, we control vegetation through irrigation and what have you, and all these other factors. So I think large predators can have this effect. The question becomes, do we expect to see it outside of a national park? And then I become very, very skeptical at that point.
I think it'd be tougher outside parks for wolves to have an effect. But you know, that's beginning to play out in places like Idaho, but I know of no studies where people have looked at in a consistent way what's been going on with plant communities. I've seen some anecdotal pictures of changes that have taken place, and they're pretty consistent with kind of like Yellowstone. Wolves are back in central Idaho, and riparian areas in places are looking better than they've ever looked. So is that due to wolves? I don't know. As you know, it's just an anecdote, but it's consistent with what we're seeing. So, you know, the wolf issue is one that's going to play out across the West and already is. So Yellowstone is the postage stamp. The federal lands, hundreds of millions of acres of public land where wolves might go, is really the test case for wolves. And I guess we'll have to see whether they have a role there, a significant role on plant communities or not. But I can tell you that ungulates today are dominating the American West, and whether it's cattle or elk or deer, hunting is not doing it. Livestock management is not allowing recovery. Whether we stuff wolves out there and hope that they're the great savior, I don't know. But we're working. So there's some really interesting futures coming at everybody, and some great opportunities for some research.
Well, I think the other the difficult situation, and you know, a lot of times Yellowstone gets referred to as this, or wolf recovery gets referred to as this great experiment, right? Well, from a technical standpoint, it wasn't an experiment. We don't have a control, and that's the biggest detriment that we've had all along, is that we have no way to know what the system would have done with and without wolves. And so we're relying on correlation. And in these terrestrial systems, there's so many confounding factors. Even in Yellowstone, like the bison have been the unforeseen one that has really kind of screwed up most of our capabilities to really pin down some of this stuff. And so I think that's the biggest struggle, is we don't have a good sense of what a system would do with and without wolves.
If I could comment on that, I actually disagree with what you said about the hunting would have made the difference, because they tried to reduce the elk in the park with hunting throughout the 80s and 90s. It was completely unsuccessful. What we see on the graph that you show the population is that they would increase, and then they would have a bad winter like they did in, what was it, 80 something, and then in the 97, and then they would crash. And during those bad winters, a lot of elk would go out of the park. There'd be really big harvests. And then mostly they would take refuge in the park after that, and they would recover. And 80% of them did stay in the park during those years. And it wasn't until you got wolves putting the pressure inside the park with the hunting outside the park, along with the other predators, that we started to see the sustained reductions. And they had to actually stop that Gardner late hunt because there was going to be too much reduction. And so I think the historical evidence there actually shows the opposite. The hunting outside the park was not sufficient to reduce the elk herd because of the protection of the park. And also that the question about, are wolves alone enough, I think is kind of, it's not really the question, because wolves are usually the first ones to go and the last ones to get back. So generally when they put the wolves in, there's already some bears and cougars there, as well as human hunting. So they're not in there by themselves except on Isle Royal. And there you do see some really extreme dynamics of a simple system, you know, of single predator and prey. And that's not normally what we're dealing with. But in the studies coming out of places where there are wolves compared to not, as Bob says, we typically see it's common to have ungulates being bottom-up controlled, even where there's human hunting, until you get wolves in there in combination with all this. And Bill and Bob had a good paper on that at one point, looking at a meta-analysis showing that it seems that wolves, when you have wolves in the system, you're more likely to get a control of those herbivore populations. Now, whether that's going to make a difference in the American West, I'm skeptical too, because are wolves going to be allowed to reach any kind of ecologically effective densities? And if cows are the thing that are suppressing plants, then that's not going to, having wolves in there isn't going to help with that. So definitely the complex systems, it's hard to say how that's going to play out.
I guess to follow up on that, there was a question from Hong Yu Shen. What analyses are being done to tease apart the relative contribution of these different factors?
I mean, there's a lot. Luke and Bob are working on all this stuff on their angle. At USU, Dan's lab is, like I said, Lainey's, I showed some of her stuff. She's working primarily with Eric Larson's Aspen data and looking at how does growth relate to different predation risk metrics over time. Tom Hobbs, I don't know if Tom's got what he's got going on or if he's got anything on the park right now. You guys might know or not.
He's retiring soon.
Okay.
And they're pulling out those dams and exclosures. And actually, I do want to talk a little bit about that before we're done.
But so I think there's been stuff and there's more stuff forthcoming on the plant side. There's actually right now, and since I started to about, I'd say about 1 or 2 years from now, I would argue will be the time when we by far will know the most ever about the ecology of the large mammals in that system. So I finished up this stuff. Lacey Smith just defended. She focused more on the demographic side of the elk population. There's another PhD student at USU that's continuing on the space use and GPS data behavior side of, so following up on my stuff. Matt Metz is about to finish in the next year or so, I think, at University of Montana, looking at wolf ecology. Colby just finished at UC Santa Cruz on the mountain lion project and understanding the density and behavior of mountain lions. So I think for the first time, I would say in the next 5 years or so, when a lot of these papers stuff rolling out, we'll find, I would argue it'll be by far the most comprehensive understanding of what we know about how the system operates across a lot of these large mammals and how that might influence lower trophic levels.
And that's in part thanks to your work, I would say. I mean, you've really.
I just got thrown in the lion's den, so I don't know if it's my fault or if I assisted it. What do you do?
You got thrown into the wolf's den, is what you got thrown into.
I had the same experience when I came in, Michael. I started working on my PhD in 2009 with Bill, and you know, that was right when all this controversy was starting that you were talking about, and Matt Kaufman was coming out with his paper, and I was like, oh man, I got to deal with all of this. So it was an interesting time to be working in Yellowstone.
Maybe before we wrap up, we want to maybe take a break from the questions online and open it up to you guys if there is any points you wanted to make, any rebuttals or.
Well, I guess the point I would make is that when wolves came back, when wolves went out of the system along with cougar, we know what happened. Plant communities went the wrong way because of heavy browsing, regardless of what the Park Service did, whether they culled or not culled. When wolves returned, bears and cougar were in the system, and so you have the complete predator guild. But nothing we saw was happening to plant communities yet. And really, if you look at the aspen holistically, nothing happens until about 2003 do we get our first inkling of aspen browsing beginning to drop off in the eastern sector of the northern range. It's about 6 years later in the western end of the northern range that we see that, and it seems to be tied to density. Elk densities are a big deal. They were dropping in the eastern sector until they got down to about 4 elk per kilometer squared. It's then that we see browsing begin to drop off and plant heights, aspen plant heights begin to increase. That's about 2003, 2004, just when wolves are peaking. 6 years later in the eastern sector, or in the western sector, when elk densities, as they are censused, came down to about 4 elk per kilometer squared, again, we saw the same thing. What's intriguing to me, and I know that this predation risk has been pushed into the background and all that as perhaps not possible or can't be very important. But if I just take the eastern sector as an example, one of the things we noticed, and Michael, you mentioned that elk just love to hammer riparian zones. Well, interestingly enough, when aspen began to grow in the eastern sector, the aspen in the riparian zones, the browsing dropped quicker and aspen began to grow quicker in riparian zones than they did in the adjacent uplands. And the adjacent uplands were like 50 to 100 meters away. So it's a paired comparison. Elk densities are the same across the landscape at that point in time. And yet here we see aspen beginning to grow taller, browsing dropping, and then they're beginning to grow taller. And we don't think it's a site difference because growth rates of unbrowsed stems are identical in the upland versus the riparian area. So we began to see this real differential, and it pushed, and I guess I would say the data seemed to push Bill and I into the direction of there's a predation risk going on here. And we were not ungulate biologists, so maybe that was the wrong call for us to make. But it didn't seem, whatever the density was, it was the same in upland and riparian areas, and yet riparian aspen were increasing. The browsing was dropping quicker, and heights were increasing. And so we got off into that direction of predation risk at a fine scale. And if it's not predation risk, I have no idea what it might be. And Michael, you might have some alternative ideas as to what's driving that. But it is something that we saw very early on. And since then, we have continued to see fine scale. We see plants recovering at a fine scale. Small areas, usually close to impediments, usually close to areas where you do not have views, you have a view impediment. Those kinds of features seem to be important. Maybe we are totally misreading what's going on out there, but that's what the plants are telling us. We're not measuring any of the ungulates. We don't know where they're at. We don't even know where the wolves are at, but the plants are telling us something really interesting is happening at that scale.
Yeah, I mean, and I know there's actually some very similar work for like European bison and like down logs and stuff like that. And so I definitely would not argue against these very fine scale things. And at the scale of what my data is able to answer, I would say that we don't see a substantial response. Now, to play devil's advocate to my own work, and one of the things that I just can't answer is, so let's assume that, you know, my models show that maybe 4 hours of the day are scary, if you will. Going back to this idea, we don't have a control. I have no idea if that 4 hours means there's 4 hours less browsing in a riparian area, or do they spend 20 hours in the riparian area and eat just as much browse? That's the part that I can't answer. And so I definitely am not suggesting, and I mean, my data can be taken both ways. My data can, for 4 hours a day, there's a behavioral response. I am not going to disagree with that at any level. How I've interpreted that is that to me suggests that there's still 20 hours a day that they can use these browse things. And so if that's the case, reducing the elk by 75% over 15 years, to me seems like the more likely big driver in any kind of plant response.
Yes, I would agree. So we were seeing this differential taking place, but the major driver was elk numbers were coming down.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal. Yes. Okay.
If I could jump in on that, I think my work about aspen confirmed that. And as Bob says, and you showed in some of our data there, we actually saw the aspen, really the strong response across the wide range starting to take off after the elk populations were getting down pretty low, not in that first few years that you singled out early on. And actually about the time that they stopped the Gardner late hunt, in which maybe would even be more inviting for elk to be outside if that behavioral thing is actually real or not that we were discussing earlier. But that certainly may have led to some of this differentiation happening where there's less pressure outside the park. But so around 2005 or so, well, so that supported the density thing. And I think part of what's going on is that when there's lots of elk and they can't get enough to eat, they just have to eat everything. And starvation becomes a big issue. But now you're finding that they're generally maintaining pretty good condition. We know that predation is more of a mortality factor than starvation. So now that they're kind of in a different situation and they don't have to eat everything. And what I'm wondering about this fine scale stuff that Bob was mentioning, what I can't answer is, is there less browsing in these riparian areas and some of these gullies and places like that? Is that a predation risk response, or is that just because it's harder to go into those places, especially when there's lots of snow? And I don't know how to answer that. I think your work does show that there's a change in foraging behavior, as other studies have also shown changes in habitat use and foraging behavior in response to predators. And that could be part of what's causing this heterogeneity on the landscape. And maybe it's a combination of these factors, but I agree that the density thing seems dominant. I'm not so sure. I'm becoming less convinced of that, though, as I've been studying the willows. And I published a paper on willows last year that I've presented some evidence, historical data, showing that, confirming what Beyer had found, and also some other people like Bob, that there was an early response of willows in those early years where they started getting taller in some places. And I've not found support for the incision hypothesis of the Colorado State people. I think the alternative state thing bears some, it has some validity in that with everything so short and eaten down, it's easier for animals to stay on top of it. It's harder for those plants to recover. But that incision effect, I don't think that's really a dominant effect in the willow recovery. It's a localized effect in some of those sites that they were studying. So I have that in one of my recent papers. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm wondering if maybe the behavioral effect could have had some bearing on the willows recovering early on, but I don't know how to get at that.
Yeah, I think there's I'm happy to I don't know. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. It leads me I saw Staler's question on the Q&A, and I think it's a nice lead-in for kind of as we're talking about kind of big picture thoughts. So for folks that obviously don't know, Dan Staler is he's the right hand man of Doug Smith. So those two run the Yellowstone Wolf Project, and then Dan oversees the Cougar Project as well. And so Dan asked in here, for 25 years of research since wolves returned, what are a couple of key data streams or questions moving forward that will help continue addressing the debate about trophic cascades and advancing our understanding of food web dynamics in places like Yellowstone? And I think each of us have already touched on it. The biggest one is figuring out what bison mean to the system. Now and in the future, particularly under climate change, when bison are going to become even harder to kill. With less snow, wolves are less and less likely to be able to kill them. That's just a matter of fact. And so how can we control bison populations inside the park? Because the Kohl outside at the edge of the park is not incredibly, it's not reducing the population. If anything, it might be maintaining it at best right now. And there's social restrictions that may become not even feasible itself to maintain the population. So I think, to me, that's the number one thing, is really getting a better handle on how bison are interacting in all of these questions. And I know Staler's going to hate me when I say this, but the other thing that has to happen is they have to have an elk calf study, so we can actually figure out who the heck's killing elk calves, where they're dying, and because I think that's one of the core drivers in the elk population demographics is and missing information. We've had 4 years of Shannon study to understand about elk calf mortality, and that pointed a pretty grim picture that bears do some serious damage. But the one thing that Shannon study wasn't able to do was relatively short term. We have no idea really what predation risk is to calves in the winter months, when wolves and cougars would be the time when they'd be killing calves. And so we don't really know how how wolves are actually influencing that important component of the population. And so to me, those are the two biggest unanswered questions going forward, that in terms of this, the ecology and the interaction with the food web of the system.
Michael, are you saying there that you think the reason Barbermeyer found a relatively low rate of calf predation from cougars is because of the time of year of the study?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and it's been a while since I've looked at the study, but by and large, all of her data collection was done by like September or October. The vast majority of the wolves and almost all the cougars, at least the cougars that we track, are on the northern range, on the winter range. And so those calves were already dead, or we didn't monitor them by the time they got to a place where they could get killed by wolves and cougars. And so we do know some about cougars and wolves because of their kill sites and tracking wolves, but we don't know very much about it from the elk's perspective, on what the ratio of a calf is going to get killed or something.
Tal said something about opening up the panel to other people in his chat.
Are y'all interested? Do you have time and energy for opening this up and having a maybe happy hour type environment?
I do, but Michael's been on the hot seat for 2 hours now, so he might.
He told me in private message that he's cool with it. So
yeah, I'm fine. I might end up having to grab a beer or something at some point.
You can take a break and grab a beer, and then I can promote people to be panelists if they just want to chat. And if anyone wants to go, that would be great.
No, yeah, I'm happy to stick around for at least a little while longer or whatever. The kids went to bed surprisingly without fussing, so evidently I'm off the hook at this point. So,
all right. Do you want to take a quick break, and then if anyone wants to chat, we can just peter out into informalities?
Yeah, that's fine. I will. There was one question here that I was going to quick. I saw that was actually, I thought was really interesting. I thought it was an interesting one for the three of us quick. Jeremy Brooks asked, so about the classic video, wolf effects may only be part of the suite of interaction. It only takes small changes in riparian systems to fundamentally change stream ecosystems through shading and organic matter inputs. So yeah, Luke and Bob, I think particularly from you guys, I mean, what's your thoughts? Is, and Bob and I both, had a little bit of a debate here on how much of a wolf effect is it, but this is an interesting question itself. Even if it's a minuscule effect, is that enough? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So we have a complete predator guild. So now separating the effects of those out is, let's say, difficult. I'll just say it's, I don't know the answer to that one. However, both bears and cougars were present, and the plant communities tell us nothing was getting any better. And it wasn't until wolves came back, it wasn't until wolves actually peaked. Now, Luke mentioned some early responses in riparian areas with regard to willows. We also had a very early response on alder. Alder's a relatively unpalatable plant. And as soon as wolves came into the park, boom, we began to pick up alder increasing and growing. So here's another plant that gives us another signature. It says something changed the day that wolves entered the park. But from the aspen standpoint, they didn't begin to do anything until really 2003, roughly, and that's when wolves peaked. And then since then, wolf numbers have gone down and elk numbers have come down. And so, with regard to this question of can wolves change rivers, we did a study, and we called it something like we asked the question, can wolves change streams? And it's Black-tailed Deer Creek. Black-tailed Deer Creek was heavily, I'm gonna use the scientific term, hammered by elk. Beaver were gone, willows were knee-high. Doug, it's an area that you had a wolf pen in there, a holding pen, and Doug, when he went up to feed these willows or feed these elk, he says the willows were up to his calves. That's the tallest willow you had along Black-tailed Deer Creek then. And I wasn't there then. I don't, I'll trust him, but our data confirmed that the average height of willows in the early 1990s was probably, let's say in 1995, was like 40 centimeters, 30 centimeters. They were going nowhere. They were being heavily hit. And it wasn't long after that we began to see willows increase in height, We now have stabilized banks along Blacktail Deer Creek. We have what we call an inset floodplain. That is, it's a floodplain forming inside the historical floodplain. The channel incised, okay, when it was hit, when it was being heavily browsed, eventually, and beaver were gone, eventually the channel incised. So it cut down, let's say about 1/2 meter. Now that we got wolves back and we got plants coming back, we're seeing sedge communities lining the bank. We're getting overhanging banks, which is a very rare commodity in the American West, because this is a very healthy sign for a stream. We got willows holding the banks. We have alder coming in, and we have this vegetated inset floodplain coming back in. So can wolves change streams? The answer in our one study is yes. Can wolves change river? Is an interesting question, because I immediately want to think about the Lamar River. And I would argue that the Lamar River today would look incredibly different and would be a huge success story ecologically if it wasn't for 4,000 bison. The bison in the Lamar Valley are preventing any recovery. We published on that just a year or so ago. It's probably worse off now than when the elk were at their hiatus and when they were at their largest. So can wolves change the Lamar River? Zero success as to date, as to the present. But if we look at the small tributary streams, I would argue wolves have made the difference. These streams are now looking better. Now, whether it's wolves 80% or wolves 30%, I don't know what the answer is. But to me, they were the necessary component. Without them, I can't imagine we would be seeing the recovery in plant communities and the improvement in stream channels and that quality of habitat without them. So they were key, in my opinion.
There's also one other interesting fact that tends to get overlooked in this complexity, if you will. And it's funny to me because oftentimes it's attributed to it's a consequence of wolf recovery, and that is, and the video even alludes to it. And I had one of Bill's papers that talks about beaver colonies in the park, and most people interpret that as wolves reduced elk, willows and stuff started to grow, so beavers could re-inhabit or re-expand throughout the northern range. What's often overlooked in this, and I think really complicates the story, is that beavers were reintroduced to the Forest Service lands like a few miles north of the park boundary at the same basically time that wolves were introduced. So it sometimes is overlooked, or it's thought of as like, oh, the beavers followed the wolves in, and it's reality like, well, we actually just happened to put beavers at the exact same time so wolves did. And so there's this other thing that's coming in that, and this follows along with Tom's work on the willows, that those two things together, I agree, especially wolves and beavers together can do phenomenal things for stream ecology.
You're right about the timing of the introduction. However, beaver have been passing through that system forever. Okay, and if we go to Blacktail Deer Creek, which is far away from the introductory sites, this is where beaver have come in. We've also had beaver up in Glen Creek, which is far away from the introduction sites. So those beaver require food, and prior to wolves coming into the park, there was no food, zero food from them because there was just no stems. So those improving plant communities are a necessary prerequisite for beaver to come in. And yes, unfortunately, if I had my druthers, I really wish they would never have reintroduced beaver in the northern portion of the park because it just, again, muddles the story, because I think beaver recovery would have begun without that reintroduction.
Yeah, like there's plenty of bank dwelling beavers in Lamar that they're there. They just aren't on the tributaries.
Yes. Yep. But now they can. Now, like black-tailed deer and some of the other ones, they have an opportunity to make a home.
There's been a series of dams on the West Blacktail since 2011. They went away one year, they came back. They seem to be doing pretty well there, and there's plenty of willows there to support them. Yeah. And in my willow study up on Slough Creek, farther up the creek, there's a stand of willows that's grown in since the reintroduction of wolves, the decline of the elk, and they've actually been cut by beavers and then grown back to 3 or 4 meters within that time, and there's beavers still persisting there. So I think to me, the bison are becoming the big factor defining this. It's not 100% because there's still a lot of elk over around Mammoth, and they're having some pretty good effects, significant browsing effects over there. But in general, especially the Lamar Valley, it's the bison. And I'm coming up with this hypothesis that what I'm seeing is that there was a kind of a sweet spot where the elk were going down and the bison hadn't come up yet, where the plants were starting to recover even in the Lamar Valley. And that's when I was first started noticing these bison effects with my first work there in 2010. There were some tall willows that were growing in. Well, now I'm seeing bison tearing those tall willows down even with their horns, and they're breaking off some of the tall aspens so that 2 meter thing isn't as meaningful as it was because they just snap them off. So they're actually driving it back somewhat from some of the recovery that we'd seen happening there. It's a very interesting effect.
Yeah.
Well, Jessica, do we want to open it up to everybody, or I don't know how that works with you guys'
I don't either.
webinar structure or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you again, Michael and Luke and Bob, for coming here. And I think that a lot of people were watching this, but this is going to be an amazing resource for ecology classes worldwide about ecological complexity, and pretty excited about it. All right, people, attendees, there's some of you left. If I don't know who you are, it's going to be harder to make sure that you are not a Zoom bomber.
And thank you, Colin, Colton, and Jessica for putting this together, and Michael for doing it. I was pretty excited about it, and I'm really glad that it happened because it was a really good thing to hear you present your work, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite. Like I said, it's too bad it's not in person, but I mean, I guess the benefits of this is it does make it a little bit more easy to kind of get people from everywhere to do these things.
So do you need to run? I'm going to press stop recording here, and
I just paused it.
Oh, okay, good.
I don't know if we want to just stop now. I was like, well, now they can Zoom bomb whoever wants. We paused it.
We'll just blame it on Dana. It's really her fault if something bad goes wrong. So
that was immediately going to happen. So.
All right.
Great work, everybody. That
We
was
had
fun.
a lot of really good questions. I mean, we didn't get to them all, but there's a lot of really good ones.
yeah, I saw Joel was trying to put me on the spot there, and I'm not answering that question without a lot of alcohol in me.
I
So
promoted him to a panelist. Maybe he'll come. Oh, Matt Metz is still on here.
I wanted Joel's question answered too, Mike. That was a good
I
one.
answered yours. That should count for something. So.
I noticed. Good job.
Well, okay. I'll initiate Joel's question, I guess. Joel asked, "What is the bigger conservation risk? Telling people trophic cascades don't exist, or telling them you can remove an apex predator for decades, and when you return them, everything will be promptly restored?"
It will not be promptly